There is a moment every empath reaches a silent, brutal, sacred breaking point. It does not arrive with rage, nor does it come with noise. It comes quietly, after years of being the one who understood everyone and was understood by no one. It is the moment when the soul finally whispers, "No more." It is the moment when the giver realizes that endless compassion has become a form of self-erasure, when the healer finally sees that saving others has been killing them, when the one who absorbs everyone's chaos begins to drown in their own stillness. And the shift that follows that violent, liberating internal shift is not gentle. It is not graceful. It is not what the world calls healing. It is destruction. Beautiful, necessary destruction. For years, the empath carries the emotional weight of the world like an invisible atlas. They are the unacknowledged therapist of every broken friend, the silent container of unspoken trauma. They become fluent in decoding tone, energy, silence, reading faces like scripture, reading pain like prophecy. They see through masks, but out of mercy, they pretend not to. They love people for their potential, not their patterns. They forgive endlessly, believing endurance equals virtue. But empathy without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. And one day, the empath sees it clearly. Every time they said yes to preserve peace, they were carving another scar into their own soul. Every time they saved someone who refused to grow, they were delaying their own evolution. Every time they absorbed the pain of another, they were dimming their own light until even the mirror forgot their reflection. That is when the brutal shift begins. The heart that once overflowed with softness begins to harden not into bitterness, but into precision. It begins to separate truth from performance, energy from intention. It stops mistaking pity for love and silence for loyalty. It learns that compassion without discernment is not kindness, it is weakness disguised as virtue. The empath begins to remember that they too were meant to feel their own life, their own fire, their own boundaries. And when they finally say no more, something ancient stirs inside them, the buried self, the self that was silenced for the comfort of others. It rises not to destroy, but to reclaim. This is what Jung called the return of the shadow. For the empath, the shadow is the part of them that was taught to feel guilty for strength, ashamed of anger, afraid of power. But anger, when purified, becomes clarity. Boundaries, when sharpened, become love. And power, when owned consciously, becomes protection. The empath who says no more becomes a force that others do not recognize. Because for the first time, their energy is no longer leaking. Their attention, once scattered across 1,000 emotional threads, now folds back inward toward the center. They no longer chase closure. They no longer justify silence. They no longer explain themselves to those committed to misunderstanding them. People who once depended on their compliance will call them cold. Those who fed off their endless forgiveness will call them cruel. But this is not cruelty, this is resurrection. It is the empath reclaiming the fragments of their soul from every person who mishandled them. It is the end of emotional servitude. When an empath stops apologizing for their boundaries, the entire dynamic of their world collapses. The manipulator loses its supply. The victim loses its rescuer. The narcissist loses its mirror. The empath steps out of the triangle completely, and that is when their real life begins. You see, empathy was never meant to be submission. It was meant to be wisdom in motion. It was meant to feel the energy of others, discern it, and decide. But the world taught empaths to equate love with martyrdom, to call exhaustion purpose, to mistake bleeding for bonding. And that lie, that toxic collective illusion, has cost countless souls their peace. When the empath awakens, they realize that peace is not something you create externally. Peace is the byproduct of alignment. You do not find peace by making others happy. You find it by refusing to abandon yourself again, and so the shift continues. The empath begins to observe, not absorb, to respond, not react, to feel, but not fuse. They become precise with their time, careful with their presence, selective with their compassion. They begin to speak a new language, a language of energy. They stop explaining their worth through words and let vibration do the speaking. Their silence becomes louder than their pleas ever were. Their absence becomes their message. The world begins to treat them differently. Not because it suddenly understands them, but because it can no longer use them. The empath, once seen as soft and safe, now radiates a strange new power, an energy of quiet certainty that cannot be manipulated. This is the metamorphosis Jung described as individuation, the unification of the conscious and unconscious self. The empath is no longer half a being, living as a reflection of others' needs. They have integrated the forgotten archetypes within: the warrior who defends, the sage who discerns, the sovereign who decides. And yet, with all this transformation, something miraculous happens. They do not lose empathy. They refine it. They begin to feel the world not through pain, but through awareness. They can sense sadness without drowning in it. They can witness anger without absorbing it. They can love deeply without losing themselves. The empath who says no more becomes paradox incarnate, soft but unyielding, loving but detached, present but unbound. They become what Jung called the self realized as totality, the fusion of light and shadow into wholeness. And through that wholeness, they begin to create rather than repair. You see, before this shift, empaths spend their lives fixing broken people. After the shift, they start building worlds. They become creators, artists, thinkers, innovators, because all that energy they once poured into emotional triage now fuels purpose. The empath who once asked, "Why can't I save them?" now asks, "Why did I need to?" That question shatters the last illusion, the belief that love must hurt to be real. This is where the empath finally understands that self-abandonment is not noble. It is cowardice, disguised as care. Because true love divine, awakened love, cannot bloom in the soil of self-denial. And so they stop rescuing and start revealing. They stop explaining and start embodying. Their very existence becomes a mirror, not of others' pain, but of what wholeness looks like. People who once drained them now feel exposed in their presence. Their energy reveals the truth that words conceal. They no longer argue. They no longer convince. They simply are. This is the brutal shift that terrifies the world, the empath who no longer needs to please it. Because when an empath detaches from manipulation, they become uncontrollable. And when they become uncontrollable, they become truly powerful. Not power in the traditional sense, not dominance or status or pride, but power in its purest form, energetic sovereignty. They move through life untouched by chaos, not because chaos disappears, but because it no longer finds a doorway in. Their energy becomes a fortress, silent, luminous, unwavering. Their boundaries are no longer walls built from fear, but gates of discernment built from truth. They let in what resonates and release what doesn't. They stop fearing rejection because alignment has replaced approval. This is when the empath finally becomes the master of their own frequency. They learn that every emotion, every thought, every choice is a code they send into reality, and that reality always, unfailingly, responds. The empath begins to create consciously, not through force, but through vibration. They speak less, but their words carry more weight. They do less, but their presence does more. They trust timing, intuition, and flow the very qualities they once suppressed to survive in a world that mocked sensitivity. Because now they understand sensitivity is not fragility. It is precision. It is intelligence beyond intellect, the body's direct communication with truth. The empath's intuition sharpens into insight. Their compassion evolves into clarity. Their sensitivity, once their burden, becomes their weapon. And with that weapon, they do not harm, they reveal. They cut through falsehood, through manipulation, through self-deception. They see through the ego's disguises, both in others and in themselves. And they hold that awareness with grace because they remember what it was like to be asleep. This is the moment the empath becomes untouchable, not because they are detached from emotion, but because they have mastered it. They no longer fear the storm, they are the calm beneath it. They no longer avoid confrontation, they meet it with presence. They no longer beg for love, they emanate it. And when others ask what happened, what changed, they will not have words to explain. Because you cannot describe transcendence to those still addicted to pain. You can only embody it. The empath who says no more stops being a character in other people's stories. They become the author of their own. Their life ceases to revolve around healing others and begins to orbit around expansion, mastery, creation. They begin to build from peace rather than from pieces. And everything they touch, relationships, work, art, silence, begins to reflect that peace. That is the true power of the empath who awakens. They do not burn bridges. They stop standing in places that demand they shrink. They do not seek revenge. They outgrow the battlefield entirely. They do not chase love. They become the vibration of it. And when you reach that place, when you say no more and mean it, the entire architecture of your reality rearranges itself around your truth. Because the universe does not obey words. It obeys frequency. When you stop apologizing for your boundaries, life stops sending people who test them. When you stop living as an emotional sponge, you stop attracting chaos. When you stop defining yourself through the pain of others, you begin to feel the joy of being you. The empath's no more is not rejection. It is a declaration. I choose to be whole. It is the moment you step out of the role of the healer and become the embodiment of healing itself. It is the moment you realize that your softness is not meant to be drained, it is meant to be directed. That your empathy is not a weakness, it is divine intelligence waiting for your command. And so, the empath who once carried the world finally sets it down. And the world, sensing the loss of its silent caretaker, trembles not from anger, but from awakening. Because the moment an empath says no more, the world loses its supply of unconscious energy and must finally face itself. That is how the empath heals humanity. Not by absorbing its pain, but by refusing to. The brutal shift is not the end of kindness. It is the beginning of truth. It is the rebirth of power that no longer apologizes for existing. And once that shift happens, once you have spoken that sacred, no more from the core of your being, nothing and no one can touch you again, because you have become what the world secretly fears most, a heart that feels everything and yet bows to no one. The moment an empath says no more, the axis of their reality tilts. Not a small shift, but a tectonic rearrangement of their inner world. The vibration that once drew brokenness now begins to summon sovereignty. The same eyes that once searched for pain to fix now look upon life as a canvas waiting to be created, not cured. It is the end of absorption and the beginning of direction. For the empath who once served as the world's emotional sponge now becomes the conductor of energy itself. They no longer sit beneath the storm. They summon lightning. The ones who used to drain them will start to avoid them, though they won't understand why. They'll say, "You've changed," as if it's an accusation. And the empath will simply nod because change was the point. Because to remain what you were when it was killing you is not loyalty, it's spiritual suicide. There is a holy solitude that follows this awakening, a silence that hums like divinity. It is in that silence that the empath finally meets their true self, not the self that was conditioned to please, to fix, to absorb, but the one that creates. For the first time, their energy is fully available to them. And with that reclaimed energy, they begin to build a life that resonates with the rhythm of their soul. This is where purpose is born not from effort, but from alignment. Because the empath who says no more no longer moves from obligation. They move from clarity. They give not to be liked, but because giving is their nature now chosen, not coerced. They speak differently. They walk differently. They radiate something rare in this era of emotional chaos: coherence. And coherence is magnetic. It draws in those who vibrate at truth and repels those who feed on confusion. You see, every empath was meant to be a leader, not a servant. But the world teaches them early that power is dangerous, that boundaries are selfish, that kindness means self-abandonment. That conditioning keeps them small, but only until it doesn't. Because once they awaken, they realize that power was never cruelty. It was creation. And creation, when directed by a conscious heart, is the most compassionate act of all. This is when the empath begins to operate from what Jung called the transcendent function, the synthesis of all contradictions within. They no longer split themselves between saint and sinner, lover and warrior, giver and protector. They become all of it, and that integration makes them whole, untouchable, radiant, in a way the world cannot decode. People will sense it before they understand it. They'll feel peace in their presence, but will not know why. Because true peace, the kind forged in the fires of awakening, vibrates like truth, steady, unshakable, ancient. It's the peace that comes when you've looked at your own darkness and found light within it. From this space, the empath stops trying to be understood. They no longer translate their depth for shallow minds. They no longer chase closure from those committed to chaos. They no longer confuse chemistry for connection. They no longer trade self-respect for temporary harmony. Their no becomes sacred. Their absence becomes their boundary. Their detachment becomes their medicine. And soon, something miraculous begins to happen. Their outer world rearranges itself to match their inner revolution. The relationships that once demanded their saving quietly dissolve. The patterns that once haunted them lose their pull. Even their environment begins to shift, opportunities appearing with uncanny timing, synchronicities unfolding like choreography, because energy once owned becomes destiny. This is the secret that mystics and alchemists encoded in their symbols, that Jung spent a lifetime trying to translate into modern language. When the inner world transforms, the outer world cannot help but follow. The empath who says no more becomes a creator of reality. They stop living reactively and begin to design consciously. Their imagination becomes blueprint. Their intuition becomes compass. Their emotion becomes command. Every feeling they once feared, anger, grief, loneliness, becomes an ally. They understand now that emotion was never the enemy. Repression was. That every suppressed feeling carried information, a message from the deeper self. That pain was never punishment. It was guidance. And so they no longer run from it. They invite it. They sit with it until it reveals its gift. Because the awakened empath no longer seeks comfort, they seek truth. This is the brutal elegance of awakening. You lose everything that isn't real. The illusion of control, the illusion of safety, the illusion that love must be earned. But what remains after the fire is indestructible. What remains is self unfiltered, undiluted, divine. You become the archetype Jung called the self-made conscious, the merger of your infinite and finite nature. No longer at war with your own empathy, no longer exhausted by the emotions of others. Because now you operate from center, not surface. And from that center, your energy expands outward like a sun, not blinding, not scorching, illuminating. It reveals what's hidden. It transforms without effort. It leads without command. People begin to follow your energy without understanding why. They sense safety around you, not because you absorb them, but because your presence reminds them of what wholeness feels like. You've become an archetype, the embodied healer, not the exhausted one. You no longer carry others across the fire. You stand on the other side, showing them it can be done. You begin to attract relationships that mirror your strength, not your wounds. Conversations that feed your mind instead of draining your soul. Environments that expand your frequency instead of suffocating it. Because your no has become the filter that purifies your reality. This is the empath's true awakening, not to feel more, but to feel wisely, to love without losing self, to give without expectation, to walk in compassion without carrying another's karma. You begin to see clearly that love and boundaries are not opposites. They are the same force expressed in different forms. Boundaries are love turned inward. Love is boundaries turned outward. And so the empath who once lived at the mercy of emotion now lives in mastery of energy. They don't just sense the unseen, they shape it. Their mind becomes still enough to receive direction from the higher dimension Jung called the collective unconscious, the field where symbols, archetypes, and truth originate. They realize that life is not happening to them, it is responding through them. That every situation is feedback, every encounter a reflection, every delay divine precision. They no longer take things personally, they take them symbolically. The world becomes a mirror, not a battlefield. Every obstacle becomes a teacher, every ending an initiation, every rejection a redirection toward alignment. This is the brutal, holy, and irreversible shift of the empath who says no more. It is not the end of feeling. It is the birth of knowing. It is the transmutation of the soul from sponge to sculptor, from victim to vessel, from healer to creator. And once this shift occurs, there is no going back, because you cannot unsee truth. You cannot unknow power. You cannot unfeel freedom. From here, the empath walks with quiet authority. They are no longer in search of love, they are love moving through form. They no longer fear the darkness, they are the light that gives it meaning. They no longer beg the world to change, they embody the change. And as they move through life with this awakened vibration, others will feel it too. They will sense it in their bones, the presence of someone who cannot be deceived, cannot be drained, cannot be diminished. Someone whose kindness no longer comes from guilt, but from power. Because when an empath says no more, they are not rejecting the world. They are rebalancing it. They are reminding the collective that love without boundaries is chaos, and empathy without self-awareness is slavery. This is the revolution the world does not expect, the rise of the conscious empath. The ones who no longer absorb energy, but transform it. The ones who do not scream change, but embody it. The ones who do not fight darkness, but outshine it. And in that light, clear, grounded, unstoppable, the empath finally becomes what they were always meant to be. Not the caretaker of everyone else's wounds, but the keeper of their own truth. That is the moment everything shifts. That is the day power and peace become the same thing. And that is the legacy of every empath, brave enough to say those two sacred words, no more. And then comes the quiet after the storm, not silence born of exhaustion, but the deep, resonant silence of arrival. It is the sound of a soul no longer divided against itself. The empath stands at the center of their own being, no longer bending toward every pull, no longer breaking to keep the peace. They have outgrown the reflex to rescue. They have outgrown the need to be understood. They have outgrown the stories that once kept them small. Their energy is clean now, unentangled, unpolluted, unafraid. They look at the world not through the eyes of hurt, but through the eyes of creation. And what they see is simple. Every person is a mirror. Every mirror is a lesson. Every lesson is an invitation to remember. This is the ultimate awakening. Not to stop feeling, but to feel everything without resistance. To let love flow through without attachment. To let loss come without collapse. To let life unfold without the demand that it be comfortable. You see, when an empath says no more, it is not rebellion. It is remembrance. It is the soul remembering its sovereignty after lifetimes of servitude. It is the divine remembering that to create, it must first separate, that to love the world, it must no longer be consumed by it. Now, their empathy is not reaction, it is choice. They choose what to carry, they choose what to give, they choose what to feel. And in that choice lies the purest form of freedom a human being can know. From that space, their presence alone begins to heal. Not because they are trying, but because they have become alignment itself. Their energy does not bend, it calibrates. Their silence does not withdraw, it restores. Their love no longer seeks, it emanates. People still come to them, drawn by something they can't name. But now the empath no longer gives pieces of themselves away. They hold space, instead vast, steady, powerful, where others can remember their own light. Jung wrote that the greatest gift one human can give another is to hold their darkness without judgment. That is what the awakened empath does, not by taking it on, but by seeing through it. Their eyes have become portals through which truth remembers itself. And so they walk through the world like living paradox, soft yet unyielding, open yet untouched, luminous yet grounded. They are no longer the sponge, they are the sun. They no longer absorb, they radiate. They no longer seek peace, they are peace. Everything they once begged the world to give them validation, understanding, love, belonging now, flows outward from their being like a river that has found its source. They have become self-generating, self-defining, self-illuminating. This is the final transformation of the empath, to realize that all along they were never meant to save others from their pain. They were meant to show them how to face it. They were never meant to fix the world. They were meant to become the living proof that it can heal itself. Because when one empath awakens, the frequency of the whole world rises. There no more becomes a vibration that echoes through generations. It teaches the next souls born into sensitivity that boundaries are holy, that self-love is not selfish, that peace is not passivity, and that feeling deeply is not a curse, it is creation waiting to be directed. This is the legacy of the empath who said no more. They did not disappear into bitterness or isolation. They became a new kind of light, the kind that no longer flickers when the world trembles. And perhaps that is the destiny of every empath, to begin as the healer of others and end as the master of self. To begin as the absorber of pain and end as the transmitter of power. To begin as the one who feels too much and end as the one who knows without needing to feel at all. So if you are standing at that threshold now, weary, broken, and whispering no more, understand this. You are not giving up. You are waking up. The storm inside you is not your ending. It is the ceremony of your becoming. And when it passes, when the debris of every false identity settles, you will find yourself standing in the clear, unshakable truth that has waited for you all along. You are not here to drown in the world's emotions. You are here to remember. You are the ocean, vast, ancient, and entirely your own. So let them call you cold. Let them call you changed. Let them say you've become distant, detached, different, because what they're really seeing is the end of their control and the birth of your power. You have not hardened. You have crystallized. You have not closed. You have clarified. You have not stopped feeling. You have started choosing. And that choice, that sacred, final, no more, is the moment the empath ceases to survive and begins to live.